Tonight we begin our discussion of the Republic, which is a dialogue on the nature of justice. We begin Book 1, where we find a group of friends gathered at the house of Cephalus discussing the nature of justice. Several definitions are going to be offered, and each of these will be critiqued by Socrates. This book, the first book of the Republic, is going to set up everything that goes on in the rest of the dialogue, the nature of justice in terms of an analysis of the soul. But let's begin with the kinds of the definitions that are offered, the preliminary definitions. The first one we find at 331e, and it is that justice is to give each what is owed to him. This definition is going to be found wanting by Socrates because he says, look, if justice just means to give each what is his due, then it might be the case that, for instance, somebody who has given you a knife wants it back when that person is crazy and would start killing people with that knife. So it can't be the case that justice would just give a person his due, namely what is owed to him, his knife, because there's going to be those situations where people are just crazy. The second definition of justice occurs at 332d, and that is where he says, to be just is to give benefits to friends and harm to enemies. And Socrates is going to critique that definition as well, on the grounds that a person might be mistaken about who his or her friends are, or who his, her, or her enemies are. And if you can make such mistakes, and then he also argues that it is best to harm unjust people, then what you get is the conclusion that justice is the opposite of what was said, and justice is then harming friends that are bad for you and benefiting enemies. Then we're going to move then to the third definition of justice, which is supposed to be an improvement on the second one, and that is justice means the art and craft of treating a friend well, provided that friend is really a good friend, and to harm an enemy, provided that that enemy is in fact bad. And very importantly, Socrates is going to tell us here that harming anybody actually makes them worse. So, and people who are harmed and who become worse are bound to become more unjust, which means that to harm an unjust person is just going to make them more dangerous. They become more unjust, more unruly, more crazy, and they're therefore, in some sense, more fearsome enemies. And Socrates then concludes that it can't then be the function of a just person to harm or a friend or anyone else. It is never just to harm anyone. So we've had these three then initial definitions of justice, and each of them are shown to be wanting. So we need to figure out how then, given these problems, how is it that we can redefine justice in such a way that these problems will no longer arise. Now, it's in the context of this discussion that Thrasymachus comes on the scene. Who is Thrasymachus? He is one of the political sophists, and we talked at length about the sophists in one of our prior classes. So here he is, he comes on the scene. Now, while we were speaking, Thrasymachus had tried many times to take over the discussion, but was restrained by those sitting near him, who wanted to hear our argument to the end. When we paused after what I had just said, however, he could not keep quiet any longer. Crouched up like a wild beast about to spring, he hurled himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. Polemarchus and I were frightened and flustered as he roared into our midst. What nonsense you two have been talking all this time, Socrates. Why do you act like naive people, giving way to one another? If you really want to know what justice is, don't ask questions and then indulge your love of honor by refuting answers. You know very well it is easier to ask questions than to answer them, and so forth. Now read the discussion with Thrasymachus with care. It is very, very finely crafted, and there's a great deal of Socratic irony here. Notice what is said at 336e. His words startled me, and looking at him, I was afraid. And I think if I had not seen him before he looked at me, I would have been dumbstruck. But as it was, I happened to look at him just as he began to be exasperated by our argument. So I was able to answer, and trembling a little, I said, "Do not be too hard on us, Thrasymachus. If Polemarchus and I made an error in our investigation of the accounts, you may be sure that we did so involuntarily," and so forth. So you see here Socrates giving way to Thrasymachus, but in the end, he is going to completely outsmart Thrasymachus. Now, what is Thrasymachus's account of justice? At 338b, Thrasymachus tells us that justice is nothing other than what is advantageous for the stronger. What does this mean? It basically means that might makes right. This is what Thrasymachus wants to argue that justice is. So the idea would be here that whoever is in power gets to decide what is right and what is just. It is in virtue of having such power that the individual just is able to decree what is that is right. Here we have an understanding of justice in the context of tyranny. So at 339c, Thrasymachus is going to tell us a law is correct if it prescribes what is advantageous for the rulers themselves, and incorrect if it prescribes what is disadvantageous for them. So again, what is going to be just is what is good for the ruler, what is advantageous to the ruler. Now, how is Socrates going to critique this view? The first thing he does is he asks Thrasymachus, is it possible for a ruler to be mistaken about what is advantageous to him? And Thrasymachus is going to admit that that is certainly a possibility. And so then Socrates says, but the rulers sometimes err if they do not know what is truly advantageous for them. And if this is the case, justice can mean to do what is not advantageous for the ruler. So in other words, if the ruler is mistaken about what is advantageous for him or her and then makes this decree about something and he tells people to obey him or her, but in fact this is not really what is advantageous to him, then it can be just to do what is not advantageous to the ruler, thereby critiquing or contradicting Thrasymachus' definition. So in the first round of the discussion with Thrasymachus, Socrates gets the upper hand. Thrasymachus comes back roaring, though, and he's going to say and try to argue that the life of the unjust person is better than the life of the just person. So we have a slightly different theme here, and this is going to be another one of the very important themes that are going to be worked out in the Republic as a whole. Thrasymachus is going to argue how much more advantageous it is to be unjust than to be just. Importantly, he's not talking about temple robbers, because the temple robbers, they're just doing injustice on a small scale. They're going to get caught and then they're going to be thrown in jail. So they're not going to really be happy. No, the kind of injustice that he's talking about is really grand injustice. He's talking about somebody who is a tyrant, who takes control of everything and then kidnaps and enslaves the people so that all the means of power are in his or her control. And he's going to argue it's that person who's taken control, who's taken all power, who's at the top of the pyramid, and who is just using everybody else for his own means or her own means, right? Usually it's him. That's the person that is going to be really happy. So he says at 344c, he tells us that injustice, if it is on a large scale, a large enough of a scale, is stronger, freer, and more masterful than justice. And this is then now what Socrates is going to take issue with. Thrasymachus, being the political sophist that he is, tells us that justice is a kind of noble naivete, that injustice is prudent, that unjust people are wise and good if they commit complete injustice. And what Socrates is going to do is to show that injustice cannot be wise and it cannot be strong. Now, I want to focus on his arguments regarding why injustice cannot be strong, because these arguments really sort of set up some of the larger arguments in the later books of the Republic. Socrates asked Thrasymachus, "Do you think that a city, an army, a band of robbers or thieves, or any other group with a common unjust purpose would be able to achieve it if its members were unjust to one another?" This is going to be at 351c. So the issue here is, what happens if you have a group of people and they're all unjust to one another? Are they going to be able to act with a common purpose? Or is there going to be a lot of backbiting, a lot of quarrels? Are they always going to be getting in one another's way? And if they are doing that, isn't that going to diminish significantly the strength of that group? At 351e, Socrates notes, "Well, then, my amazing fellow, if injustice arises within a single individual, will it lose its power or will it retain it undiminished?" And then, as a kind of explanation of this, he's going to talk about, again, what happens with groups where there's all sorts of factions and the group then cannot act in concert, and how that is analogous to what's going on in the individual. So he says, apparently then its power is such that whenever it comes to exist in something, whether in a city, a family, an army, or anything else whatsoever, it makes that thing, first of all, incapable of acting in concert with itself. So the group can't agree because all of the people are fighting one another, because of the faction and difference it creates, and second of all, an enemy to itself, and to what is in every way its opposite, namely justice. So injustice makes the group an enemy to itself because the group can no longer function properly. Similarly, this is going to be the same thing in the case of the individual. He says, and in a single individual, too, I presume, it will produce the very same effects that it is in its nature to produce. First, it will make him incapable of acting because of an inner faction and not being of one mind with himself. Second, it will make him his own enemy as well as the enemy of the people. So how is this possible? What does this mean? That it's going to make the person incapable of acting? Well, this is going to have to do with the fact that the individual has many different desires that are going to be vying for supremacy or control of the soul. The inner faction that Socrates is speaking about here with regard to the soul has to do with the many desires that an individual has. When there's injustice in the soul, there's no way of adjudicating between the different desires. There's no way of giving some kind of rational account of why one desire should take precedence over the other. All of the desires are just there teeming. In the end, it'll just be the strongest desire that takes precedence. At one moment, it'll be one desire that is the stronger, and at another moment, it'll be another desire that is the stronger. And those two desires may be completely contradictory. And for this reason, Socrates is going to say that when you have injustice in the soul, the individual is incapable of action. Why is he or she incapable of action? Because there's no way to have any kind of plan of action. And if it's the strongest desire that takes precedence, well, at one moment, one desire can be the strongest, and at another moment, another desire can be the strongest. And it could be the case that these two desires are contradictory, so that there can't be any kind of directed plan of action. At one moment, an individual wants to fulfill one desire, and at another moment, he or she will want to fulfill another desire. But if this is the case, the desires are not controlled. But think about what it means to have any kind of plan of action. You have a goal, and then you must control yourself and control all of your desires or keep them in check in order to do what is necessary to achieve that goal. So that there has to be some kind of rational control over the desires. If there is no such rational control, the individual is first doing one thing, then doing another thing, but none of those actions are really centered on a particular goal. And without that kind of centering of the actions or directing the actions to a particular goal, the individual is just all over the place and therefore is ineffective. It's here at the end that Socrates is going to start talking about the function of a horse and the function of a soul, and talk about virtue in terms of that function. So what is virtue? Virtue is an excellence, and it has to do with proper functioning. When a horse functions properly, it has an excellence. All of its parts are together in a particular way, and they function together harmoniously in a particular way, and that allows the horse to function. The same thing is going to be true of the soul. When the soul functions properly, it will be due to the excellence of the soul. It is put together in such a way that it can function properly and harmoniously. So he talks about, well, what is the function of a soul? The function of a soul is taking care of things, deliberating, and all other such things. And he's going to argue then that a soul cannot perform its proper function if it's deprived of its own proper virtue. And when we talk about virtue again, virtue has to do with excellence. So if the soul has all of these desires and these desires are in conflict with one another, and there's no way of adjudicating the desires, the soul is at odds with itself, and it cannot really will. So it's at odds with itself, it's contradicting itself, and it is its own worst enemy when it is not properly structured. And this is the argument that he concludes that first book of the Republic with. We'll see then, so Thrasymachus is routed thoroughly by Socrates in this argument, and he retreats. So this is again part of that Socratic irony we saw at the beginning, Thrasymachus coming on the scene, very ferocious, with all of that anger and power and so forth, and Socrates retreating. And ironically, with his gentle arguments or way of arguing, Socrates completely routs Thrasymachus, and the wild beast Thrasymachus is forced to retreat. And that again concludes Book 1. The same themes are going to be taken up again in Book 2, as we will see, with stronger arguments that are supposed to bolster Thrasymachus's position to see if Socrates can answer those stronger arguments. This then concludes my video on Book 1. I hope that it has been helpful. Please post comments or questions on the discussion board on Blackboard, or you can post them below, and I will try to get to them. Good night, and I will see you again tomorrow.